Hey guys, Las Vegas in the 1950s is often remembered as a glittering desert dream of neon, cocktails, and effortless glamour. But for the people who actually lived there, it was also a place of dust, shift work, strict routines, fragile comforts, and a strange kind of loneliness hidden just behind the lights. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me which history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quiet like on the video is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, intelligent journeys into the past, subscribing is the best way to find your way back here. Now, to understand what everyday life was really like in 1950s Las Vegas, it helps to begin not with the casino floor, but with the desert itself. Because that was the first fact of life in Las Vegas, and perhaps the most important one. Before the city was a fantasy, it was an environment. It was heat, dryness, distance, and light so strong it could feel almost metallic in the middle of the day. Visitors arrived and saw spectacle. Residents woke up to wind-blown grit on windowsills, dry throats in the morning, and a town that still felt, in many ways, improvised. Even in the decade that helped define its image, Las Vegas was not yet an enormous metropolis. It was smaller, closer, more exposed. People ran into one another often. News moved quickly. Reputations moved even faster. That is one of the first things modern viewers often miss. The famous Las Vegas of popular memory seems vast and anonymous, but 1950s Las Vegas was, for many of its residents, intimate to the point of pressure. It was a city of performance, certainly, but also one where school teachers, pit bosses, waitresses, car dealers, shopkeepers, maids, entertainers, construction workers, and mechanics were all tied into the same narrow web of work and survival. The city promised reinvention, and to some extent it delivered it. But it also had a way of making people visible to one another, whether they wanted that visibility or not. In the early morning, before the visitors had fully reassembled themselves from late nights and blackout curtains, the city belonged to workers. Delivery trucks moved first. Kitchen crews arrived. Housekeepers began preparing hotel rooms that would soon be made to look untouched by human use. Coffee counters filled with men coming off overnight shifts and women beginning long days in service roles that demanded friendliness, speed, and restraint. A city built on leisure required enormous discipline behind the scenes. The great irony of 1950s Las Vegas was that its pleasure depended on routine so rigid that many workers experienced the place less as a playground than as a machine. The machine, of course, was profitable. That was why the city grew so quickly and why so many people came. During and after the Second World War, Las Vegas had already begun changing, helped by military installations nearby, by highway traffic, and by the expanding legitimacy of resort entertainment. By the 1950s, the Strip was becoming something more than a roadside curiosity. It was turning into a national symbol. New or newly expanded resorts competed not only in gaming, but in architecture, decor, celebrity bookings, and atmosphere. A hotel was not merely a building. It was a mood, a promise, a carefully shaped emotional experience. But daily life inside that promise could be exhausting. Casino employees worked irregular hours because the city's most important activity rarely slept. Time in Las Vegas was uneven. For a banker, a school child, or a postal worker, the day still followed a recognizable shape. For a cocktail waitress, a blackjack dealer, a lounge musician, or a bellhop, life could drift toward the nocturnal. Meals were delayed. Sleep was fragmented. Weekends mattered less, because visitor rhythms mattered more. Holidays could be busier, not gentler. Parents working hospitality jobs might see their children only in narrow windows between school and shifts, between naps and late departures, between one long workday and the next. This gave the city an unusual domestic rhythm. Behind the image of easy abundance, family life often required careful coordination. A modest home in a growing subdivision might contain someone sleeping at an odd hour because he had worked through the night, someone else ironing uniforms, children being told to keep their voices down, and a kitchen table covered not in luxury but in utility. Lunch pails, grocery receipts, ashtrays, school notices, and perhaps a small desert bouquet drying in the heat by the window. The homes themselves were not usually grand. Many were practical, compact, and quickly built to meet demand. Air conditioning existed, but it was not yet a universal blanket of comfort. In many homes, summer remained something to be managed rather than defeated. That discomfort matters because it corrects another common misunderstanding. When people imagine 1950s Las Vegas, they often imagine money flowing everywhere. But the city's glamour was highly selective. For the tourist with cash, the city offered light, abundance, and apparent ease. For the worker, even one employed inside luxurious surroundings, finances could be uncertain. Tips mattered. Schedules mattered. The difference between a good week and a bad one might depend on convention traffic, a headline performer, or sheer luck in how crowded a floor became. Many people came west believing that Las Vegas was a place where fortunes could be made quickly. Some did rise. Many more discovered that the city distributed fantasy more generously than security. Even so, the city held a powerful attraction. Part of it was economic, but part of it was psychological. Las Vegas offered permission. That permission was one of its most marketable products. Visitors could stay awake late, drink more freely, dress more boldly, and behave with a looseness that would have felt improper elsewhere. Residents lived next to that permission every day. Some enjoyed it, some resented it. Many had a more complicated relationship with it. To live in Las Vegas was to inhabit a place that asked one part of the population to create a sense of freedom for another part, often while being quite constrained themselves. The contrast could be especially sharp for women working in the resorts. Advertisements and postcards presented femininity in polished, highly controlled forms. Elegant showgirls, smiling hostesses, stylishly dressed tourists. But the everyday reality for most women in the city was work that demanded presentation and patience under pressure. Waitresses balanced trays through cigarette smoke and noise. Hotel maids cleaned up after guests who had spent the night enjoying themselves with very little thought for the labor that would follow. Clerks, secretaries, cashiers, and telephone operators formed part of the city's essential structure, though their work rarely appeared in the mythology. What looked glamorous from across a casino floor could feel repetitive, physically wearing, and carefully supervised up close. And yet it would be too simple to say that the glamour was false. That version is tempting, but it misses something important. For many people, the beauty and excitement were real, even if they were unevenly distributed. Music pouring from lounges at midnight was real. The thrill of seeing nationally famous performers in a relatively small city was real. The sense that one lived at the edge of something new, modern, and distinctly American was real too. Las Vegas in the 1950s was not merely pretending to be the future. In design, promotion, and mood, it often felt like a prototype of a more theatrical consumer culture that the rest of the country was still moving toward. This was visible on ordinary drives through town. Cars mattered enormously, not just as transportation but as insulation. Distances in the desert could feel emotionally larger than they looked on a map. A car meant escape from heat, access to work, and participation in the city's visual culture. Parking lots filled with broad-bodied American automobiles, their chrome flashing in the sun, became part of the everyday landscape. Teenagers cruised, workers commuted, couples drove out beyond the most crowded zones to find some darkness and quiet. The automobile gave shape to life in Las Vegas, where walking any serious distance in the daytime could feel punishing, and where the built environment increasingly assumed mobility. At street level, the city could still feel rough at the edges. Pavement gave way to dust quickly. Construction sites were common. New neighborhoods pushed outward. Signs rose faster than shade trees. In a place growing this quickly, there was often a sense that the city was being assembled in real time. That brought opportunity but also instability. A booming town creates jobs, but it also creates impermanence. Businesses opened and failed. Workers arrived and left. A place built on optimism could also produce fatigue, because optimism is easiest to sell and hardest to live inside continuously. Children experienced the city differently. For them, Las Vegas was not necessarily a symbol. It was simply home. They went to school under intense sun, played on hot ground, and absorbed the odd fact that their hometown was famous for things not meant for them. They lived near marquees and gaming rooms, but their daily lives were shaped by school schedules, church activities, local stores, and neighborhood friendships. At the same time, they grew up unusually close to adult worlds of money, vice, entertainment, and performance. Even if parents tried to create ordinary domestic lives, the larger atmosphere of the city was hard to keep entirely outside the door. The schools themselves reflected a fast-growing population. A town that expands quickly must build classrooms quickly too, and that often means strain. Teachers worked in a place where civic pride and civic pressure developed side by side. Local leaders wanted Las Vegas to appear modern, prosperous, and stable, but growth brought very practical burdens. More children, more infrastructure needs, more demand for services, more visible inequalities between the polished tourist economy and the less polished realities of local life. And then there was the matter of respectability, which hung over the city in a particularly interesting way. Las Vegas in the 1950s wanted legitimacy. It wanted tourist dollars, investment, and national attention, but it also wanted to be seen as a functioning American community, not merely a den of indulgence in the desert. That created a subtle tension in everyday life. Churches, schools, civic groups, suburban development, and family routines all helped insist that this was a real city where respectable people lived and raised children. At the same time, the city's fame rested precisely on the activities that respectable mid-century America often approached with caution. So ordinary residents learned to live with contradiction. They might attend church on Sunday, then serve whiskey to vacationers on Monday night. They might maintain tidy lawns and PDA commitments while living in a city internationally associated with risk and pleasure. In that sense, 1950s Las Vegas was not simply rebellious. It was highly structured. It balanced permissiveness and discipline in unusually close proximity. That balance is one reason the place remains so fascinating. It was not chaos. It was organized escape. There was another layer too, one that becomes clearer the longer we stay with the period. The city's glamour depended heavily on who was included in its public image and who was excluded from it. The 1950s were not a simple golden age. Segregation and discrimination shaped opportunities, housing, entertainment, and movement through the city. African American performers might be celebrated on stage yet denied equal access off it. Workers could contribute to the city's success while remaining outside the full rewards of that success. To describe everyday life honestly means noticing not only the neon, but the boundaries built into the society beneath it. And once those boundaries come into view, the city appears less like a dream and more like a revealing cross-section of post-war America itself. Prosperous, performative, ambitious, unequal, and deeply invested in appearances. Las Vegas was unusual, but not entirely separate from the nation that made it. In some ways, it simply concentrated national habits into a smaller, brighter space. Consumption, image-making, suburban growth, corporate ambition, and managed leisure all met there with unusual intensity. Perhaps that is why the city could feel both exhilarating and curiously fragile. A place so dependent on mood always carries a risk beneath the surface. If the mood slips, what remains? Workers knew the answer better than tourists did. Beneath the music and lighting were inventories, payrolls, sore feet, supply chains, maintenance crews, kitchen heat, bedroom curtains blocking daytime sleep, and the practical question of whether this week's income would stretch far enough. The fantasy was real as an experience, but it was built from ordinary effort in extraordinary quantities. And in Las Vegas, even the ordinary effort had its own strange surroundings. Not far from the city, the desert opened outward again, silent and old, indifferent to neon and ambition alike. That contrast gave daily life a peculiar emotional texture. One could finish a shift beneath chandeliers and signs, drive a short distance, and be confronted by emptiness and stars. The city could feel crowded and isolated at once. It could feel worldly and provincial in the same evening. That sense of isolation, and the ways people tried to soften it, shaped much of what came next in everyday life there. Because if Las Vegas sold excitement at night, it still had to answer quieter daytime questions. Where people shopped, how neighborhoods formed, what class differences looked like up close, and how a city built for visitors slowly learned what it meant to belong to its own residents. That question mattered more than it might seem, because a city designed to dazzle outsiders still needed butcher shops, pharmacies, schools, churches, laundries, gas stations, dentists, barbers, and grocery stores. It needed places where no one was performing for a tip and no one was trying to manufacture wonder. In 1950s Las Vegas, those quieter places formed the real skeleton of everyday life. Away from the Strip, residents moved through routines that would have been recognizable in many post-war American towns, though always with the desert and the tourist economy pressing gently in from the edges. A weekday afternoon in a residential part of Las Vegas could feel surprisingly ordinary. Children rode bicycles along streets in new subdivisions where the landscaping was still thin and the promise of suburban comfort had arrived faster than mature shade. Women carried groceries into kitchens planned around modern efficiency, or at least the image of it. Radios played. Evaporative coolers hummed where they were available, and where they were not, windows were opened carefully at the right hours and curtains drawn against the fiercest light. Men who worked regular daytime jobs came home on a more familiar schedule, while those attached to the hospitality world might only just be waking, shaving, and preparing to leave as others settled in for supper. That overlap of ordinary domestic timing with upside-down working hours gave local neighborhoods a rhythm unlike most American suburbs of the era. Shopping, too, revealed the city beneath the fantasy. Residents bought food not in casino abundance but according to budget, availability, and convenience. Produce in the desert always carried the reminder of distance. Goods had to come in. Freshness had to survive transport. Refrigeration mattered. Timing mattered. There was a practical intelligence to everyday household management in Las Vegas that is easy to overlook when the city is remembered only through its most theatrical spaces. Water, cooling, dust control, and food storage were not abstract concerns. They shaped the feel of domestic life in small but constant ways. Even keeping a house pleasant required more work in that climate than the polished photographs of the period tend to suggest. And yet the newness of the city could make those domestic routines feel slightly charged with possibility. Las Vegas was still growing quickly enough that many residents felt they were helping to build a place rather than merely inheriting one. New streets appeared. New businesses opened. New neighbors arrived from California, the Midwest, the South, and the Mountain West, each bringing habits and expectations from somewhere else. This meant that local identity was still being assembled. People did not simply live in Las Vegas. They participated in a kind of ongoing negotiation over what sort of city it ought to become. Was it, at heart, a working town with a tourist district attached? Or was the tourist world the true city, with everything else arranged around its needs? In the 1950s, that answer was not yet settled. For many residents, civic life became the means of asserting that Las Vegas was more than a backdrop for nightlife. Churches played an important role in that effort. So did service clubs, school boards, neighborhood associations, local papers, youth sports, and charitable events. These institutions helped produce continuity in a place defined by transience. They gave people rituals that had nothing to do with gambling tables or lounge acts. They also helped families claim moral and social order in a city whose public image suggested the opposite. This was not hypocrisy so much as coexistence. People were building a community within, beside, and sometimes against the machinery of entertainment. That machinery, however, had a way of reaching into nearly everything. A grocery clerk might serve casino employees at odd hours. A schoolteacher's spouse might work nights on the Strip. A local doctor might treat both performers and kitchen workers. Businesses rose or struggled according to visitor traffic. Public revenue, local pride, and national attention all became tied to the success of an industry built on managed pleasure. It meant that even residents who had no personal affection for casino culture were still, in one way or another, dependent on it. This is one of the central contradictions of 1950s Las Vegas. The city was both a real hometown and an economic stage set, and the two realities could not easily be separated. The stage set itself was increasingly elaborate. Mid-century resort design in Las Vegas was not just decorative. It was strategic. Neon, fountains, themed interiors, carpets, chandeliers, and dramatic signage all worked to create emotional insulation from the surrounding desert. Guests were meant to forget distance, dryness, and practical limits. Inside, time softened. Lighting erased harsh edges. Air moved more comfortably. Noise was arranged into a controlled atmosphere of excitement. For workers, though, that artificial environment became simply another workplace. A blackjack dealer might stand beneath costly fixtures while performing repetitive calculations for hours. A cleaner might move through suites designed to seem effortless, restoring them to that appearance one ashtray, one bedsheet, one glass at a time. Luxury was real, but it was also produced, reset, and maintained by people whose own lives were often much less elegant. This gap between image and maintenance could be seen even in fashion. The glamorous clothes associated with Las Vegas were only one layer of local dress. Residents knew the city in uniforms, aprons, work shirts, school clothes, church outfits, and practical summer garments meant for heat rather than spectacle. Women who served glamorous cocktails might travel to work in much plainer clothing, changing before shift. Men in formal service roles moved between backstage corridors and public spaces with a kind of double identity, part laborer and part performer. Even tourists shifted costumes, so to speak, between poolside ease, casino polish, and weary travel clothes in the mornings. Las Vegas was a city where people were often dressing for conditions that changed not by weather alone, but by social setting. The social setting could be especially complicated for anyone trying to rise. Mid-century America encouraged the language of advancement, and Las Vegas seemed to offer unusually visible ladders. A person could begin in a modest role and imagine moving upward through proximity, charm, luck, or reliability. That belief was not entirely false. The city did reward some people quickly, especially in service, management, entertainment, and certain business trades. But upward movement was neither equally available nor purely merit-based. Connections mattered. Race mattered. Gender mattered. So did one's ability to navigate a local culture where formal institutions and informal power sometimes overlapped in opaque ways. In a place built on hospitality, appearances could disguise hierarchy rather effectively. This was particularly true in relation to race. Any honest portrait of everyday life in 1950s Las Vegas has to acknowledge that the city's famous energy existed alongside segregation and exclusion. Black residents, especially in West Las Vegas, helped build and sustain the city while being restricted in where they could live, socialize, and enjoy the very entertainments they made possible. The contradiction was glaring. African American performers could draw crowds and enrich resort reputations, yet many were denied the equal treatment routinely extended to white guests. Workers could labor inside glamorous spaces while being expected to live beyond the lines of full belonging. These were not peripheral details. They were built into the experience of the city. West Las Vegas was not simply a place of exclusion. It was also a place of community, resilience, and economic life. Businesses, churches, clubs, and households there formed a world of their own under unequal conditions. But inequality remained structural. Services were often poorer. Investment patterns reflected racial boundaries. Access to the city's most profitable spaces was controlled. For white tourists, 1950s Las Vegas could present itself as effortless and modern. For black residents, the same city could be sharply constrained, a place of ambition shaped by daily reminders of the limits imposed upon it. That contrast changes the meaning of the whole story. The city's glamour was not just selective in economic terms. It was selective in civic and human terms as well. At the same time, the city's entertainment culture complicated the lines it publicly tried to maintain. Music has a way of crossing barriers even when institutions do not. Performers, backstage workers, drivers, technical staff, and late-night social networks created forms of contact that the city's official arrangements never fully controlled. The result was a Las Vegas that looked rigid from one angle and fluid from another. The public facade claimed order, but everyday life contained negotiation, workarounds, tensions, and gradual challenges to that order. Sometimes a city reveals its true nature not in its rules, but in the practical ways people bend them to keep life moving. Another revealing part of daily life was food, because food in Las Vegas sat at the intersection of labor, tourism, ethnicity, and time. Tourists encountered buffets, coffee shops, steak dinners, cocktails, and late-night meals served at hours that would have felt extravagant elsewhere. Residents knew the other side of this abundance. The prep kitchens, supply deliveries, narrow meal breaks, and the strange fact that a city could be overflowing with food while many households still lived carefully and economically. Casino dining rooms projected ease and plenitude, but local domestic meals were often shaped by thrift, convenience, and shift schedules. A family might not sit down together at a single conventional supper hour because the city's economy had already rearranged the household clock. This altered sense of time reached into leisure as well. In many American communities, evenings belonged to families and weekends to recreation. In Las Vegas, those boundaries blurred. For hospitality workers, leisure might happen on a weekday morning or an odd afternoon. The city taught people to live around rotating intensity. This could be liberating for some, could also be lonely. A person working nights in an industry built on smiles and sociability might still struggle to maintain friendships outside that world. Fatigue has a quiet effect on community. It narrows social life even in a place full of people. That is one reason the city could feel at once lively and isolating. And then there was the desert beyond the city, which remained more present in daily imagination than postcard images sometimes suggest. Residents could not entirely forget where they were. Summer heat imposed itself. Dust storms reminded people that the landscape was not domesticated simply because neon had been planted in it. Water always had special meaning. Lawns, swimming pools, hotel fountains, and chilled interiors did not erase scarcity. They dramatized it. In a sense, one of the strangest luxuries of 1950s Las Vegas was not gambling or entertainment at all, but the visible conquest or seeming conquest of environmental limits. Cool air indoors, lit fountains at night, and fresh linens in towering hotels all implied mastery over the desert. But that mastery depended on infrastructure, energy, and constant upkeep. The miracle was practical before it was symbolic. That practicality extended to the nearby presence of atomic testing, one of the most surreal features of the era. This is another part of the story that feels almost too strange to be true until one sits with it for a moment. In the 1950s, nuclear tests at the Nevada test site were close enough that mushroom clouds could become part of the region's public imagination. Las Vegas, astonishingly, found ways to incorporate this into its identity. Tourists watched distant blasts. Souvenirs and themed promotions appeared. The atomic age was folded into entertainment. From a modern perspective, this can feel deeply unsettling, and it should. But it also made a certain mid-century sense within a culture that often equated technological power with national confidence and treated danger as something abstract so long as it remained scenic. For ordinary residents, the reality was more mixed. Some felt pride in being near the frontier of American power. Some accepted the tests as part of the national atmosphere of the Cold War. Others felt unease, whether clearly articulated or not. To live in Las Vegas during this time was to occupy a place where the future itself seemed to arrive in contradictory forms. Dazzling resorts, suburban growth, consumer optimism, and, hanging behind it all, the shadow of nuclear modernity. The city became a kind of theater for American confidence, but confidence and anxiety were often sharing the same stage. This broader national context is important because 1950s Las Vegas did not float free from the rest of the United States. It reflected post-war trends with unusual intensity. Rising car culture, consumer leisure, suburban expansion, media influence, celebrity worship, and Cold War spectacle all found a concentrated form there. In that sense, Las Vegas was less an exception than an amplifier. It made visible what much of America was becoming: more image-driven, more comfort-seeking, more commercially theatrical, and more willing to turn experience itself into a product. Residents lived inside that transition, often before the rest of the country fully recognized it. Television helped intensify this process. As media spread images of stars, resorts, performances, and a newly polished American lifestyle, Las Vegas became easier to imagine from afar and easier to mythologize in simplified form. This mattered in everyday ways. The city was no longer only what it was to its residents. It was also what it looked like to the nation. And once a place becomes an image, the people living there begin to feel the pressure of that image. They may benefit from it, but they also have to inhabit it. A child growing up in Las Vegas was not just from a town. He was from an idea. A woman telling someone elsewhere where she lived was not just naming a location. She was triggering a whole set of assumptions about glamour, vice, luck, and novelty. Many residents learned to manage those assumptions with a kind of practiced patience. They knew that most of life there was not lived beneath chandeliers. It was lived in waiting rooms, parking lots, school offices, kitchens, garages, supermarkets, modest living rooms, and sunstruck backyards. It was lived in laundry, budgeting, commuting, child-rearing, church-going, and trying to sleep through the day after a night shift. But they also knew that the city's unusual energy was real. It offered access to famous entertainers, ambitious architecture, and a sense of motion that many small or medium American cities could not match. So everyday life in 1950s Las Vegas was neither simply glamorous nor simply grim. It was unstable in a more interesting way than that. It was ordinary life conducted unusually close to spectacle. And spectacle had consequences for behavior. Even those who were not direct participants in the entertainment trade absorbed some of the city's social looseness and some of its discipline. People became skilled readers of mood. They learned when crowds would swell, when traffic would thicken, when a headline performer might change the whole tone of a week, when tips would be good, when a floor would be tense, when a neighborhood would feel especially alive, when the town would seem to exhale. Las Vegas encouraged attentiveness because it was a place where atmosphere could affect income, and income could shape everything else. By the later 1950s, that relationship between mood and money was becoming even more structured as larger business interests, more formal management approaches, and changing resort cultures began to reshape the city. The rougher edges did not disappear at once, but the balance between frontier improvisation and polished corporate control was shifting. For residents, this meant that everyday life was beginning to change again. The city that had promised reinvention was now being reinvented in place, and the people who lived there had to decide, quietly and practically, how to fit themselves into its next version. That next version of Las Vegas did not announce itself all at once. It arrived through details that might have seemed small in isolation. A more polished front office, a stricter managerial tone, new expectations about presentation, larger advertising campaigns, more deliberate branding, more money flowing through fewer hands, and a growing sense that the city was no longer merely improvising success but learning how to systematize it. For many residents, everyday life in the later 1950s began to feel slightly more ordered on the surface and slightly less personal underneath. The town was still intimate enough for gossip to matter, but it was becoming harder to believe that everyone could still find a place in it simply through nerve, charm, and timing. That shift could be felt most clearly in work. Early Las Vegas had carried a frontier quality, not because it was lawless in some romantic sense, but because its institutions were still thin and its opportunities still looked unusually fluid. By the end of the decade, more workers found themselves inside organizations that expected regularity, discipline, and loyalty. Training became more formal in some places. Standards of conduct were clearer. Image was managed more carefully because the stakes were rising. A city that had once sold itself partly through risk was increasingly selling reliability wrapped in glamour. Tourists still wanted excitement, but they also wanted comfort, cleanliness, convenience, and the reassuring sense that the fantasy would be delivered without interruption. For the housekeeper, that meant faster room turnover with fewer visible signs of strain. For the dealer, it meant a more polished manner under closer observation. For entertainers, it meant stronger expectations not only about talent, but about timing, publicity, and consistency. For bartenders, bellhops, front desk clerks, and floor staff, it meant that personal presence became part of the product in a more formalized way. In a place already dependent on performance, the performance itself was becoming more professionally administered. That did not erase the city's spontaneity, but it did narrow the space in which spontaneity could safely appear. And yet this growing polish had an oddly double effect on daily life. On the one hand, it made the city more legible and more prosperous. Jobs could feel steadier in some sectors. The urban environment looked more coherent. Tourists arrived with clearer expectations and often more money to spend. On the other hand, the local culture could feel less rough, less accidental, and perhaps less forgiving. A town that had once seemed to welcome reinvention began, in subtle ways, to sort people more firmly. Some fit the new image. Others did not. Some workers could climb with the city. Others found themselves fixed in supporting roles as the dream became more expensive and more tightly managed. Housing reflected this tension as well. More neighborhoods appeared, and suburban patterns became more established. New homes represented aspiration, stability, and a claim to permanence in a place still associated with impermanence. Lawns, carports, low rooflines, patio furniture, and television sets in living rooms helped Las Vegas resemble the wider post-war American suburban landscape. This mattered deeply to residents who wanted not only wages, but normalcy. To own or steadily rent a decent home in a settled neighborhood was, for many families, a way of saying that they belonged to something more durable than a boomtown. But suburban normalcy in Las Vegas was never entirely the same as suburban normalcy elsewhere. The climate intervened. So did the economy. A family might live in a neat ranch house and still organize its entire week around the overnight shifts of one or both parents. A child might do homework at the kitchen table while a parent slept in the next room behind darkened curtains because daylight had become, for that household, the wrong side of the clock. Neighbors might exchange greetings at odd hours because their work lives were staggered by the demands of tourism. The architecture looked mid-century American, but the lived rhythm inside it remained distinctly shaped by the city's unusual labor patterns. Television deepened this feeling of living in two places at once. Inside the home, families watched the same programs, advertisements, and national rituals as millions of other Americans. Outside, their city continued to function on a timetable and moral atmosphere that seemed slightly apart from the television world beaming into their living rooms. This could produce a curious tension between self-image and public image. Residents may have wanted the comforts and respectability of mainstream post-war life, and in many ways they had them, but they also knew that the rest of the country still imagined Las Vegas as an exception, a place where ordinary rules softened and caution lost its grip. To live there was to be normal and mythologized at the same time. That pressure could be felt in schools, where children grew up absorbing both the domestic ambitions of their parents and the highly unusual reputation of their hometown. A school day in Las Vegas might look conventional enough from the inside. Attendance, arithmetic, handwriting, assemblies, recess beneath the bright sky. But the city beyond the school grounds was teaching its own lessons. Children saw visitors who treated the city as temporary pleasure. They saw their parents fatigue after long shifts in carefully manufactured luxury. They learned, often without anyone stating it directly, that money could arrive quickly and disappear just as fast, that appearance mattered, that charm could be useful, and that adult life in their city often involved managing the moods of strangers. That last point is easy to miss, but it shaped local character in powerful ways. Service economies teach emotional discipline. They reward patience, responsiveness, timing, and the ability to absorb other people's volatility without allowing it to spread. In 1950s Las Vegas, many households depended on precisely those skills. The city's workers were not simply serving food, carrying luggage, cleaning rooms, or operating tables. They were helping to regulate atmosphere. They were protecting the mood on which the city's profits depended. A guest who felt neglected might spend less. A guest who felt welcomed might stay longer, drink more, tip better, speak well of the place, and return. So the emotional labor of everyday life in Las Vegas was unusually visible, even if it remained underdescribed. That labor had consequences at home. Anyone who spends an entire shift being pleasant on command may not have much left by the time the front door closes behind them. Fatigue in such households was not only physical, could be social and emotional too. Family life, then, often required repair as much as routine. Couples coordinated around absence. Parents had to make themselves present in compressed windows of time. Children learned when not to make noise. Meals could become less ceremonial and more opportunistic, shaped by who was awake, who had already eaten at work, who needed to leave soon, and who had enough energy to sit still together. At the same time, Las Vegas offered pleasures to residents that were quite real, and sometimes overlooked in more cynical accounts. Locals had access to entertainment, dining, and spectacle that many towns of comparable size could never have sustained. Music filtered through the city not merely as background, but as presence. Famous names on marquees were not abstract celebrities but people who, at least from a distance, were woven into the visible life of the town. For younger residents especially, this proximity could make the city feel larger than itself. It suggested that the wider world was not impossibly far away. In the desert, Beneath all the practical strain, there was also glamour enough to create genuine excitement. But even glamour has a schedule, and in Las Vegas the schedule revealed who paid for it. Late at night, when tourists drifted between tables, bars, and showrooms, the city could look effortless. In the early morning, the illusion became procedural again. Floors were cleaned, food was restocked, cash was counted, linens were changed, ashtrays were emptied, signs went dark or dimmed. Men with tools, women with carts, drivers, clerks, repair crews, and delivery workers restored the city for another cycle. A place famous for escape was sustained by repetition. That is one of the most important reversals in the story. The more magical Las Vegas seemed to visitors, the more routine it had to be behind the scenes. Routine, however, did not mean equality. The city's divisions remained visible in who did which work, who lived where, and who had access to advancement. Segregation was still a structural fact, not a footnote. Black workers and performers remained essential to the city's cultural and economic life while being denied full participation in the version of Las Vegas projected outward to the nation. The contradiction did not simply sit in the background. It shaped traffic patterns, housing realities, social opportunities, and the psychic geography of the city itself. To move through Las Vegas in the 1950s was to move through a place where brilliance and exclusion occupied the same map. This makes the city's fascination with modernity especially revealing. Las Vegas loved the look of the future. It embraced neon forms, streamlined surfaces, dramatic signs, and architectural promises of endless comfort. But future-looking design does not automatically produce future-looking justice. A city may look modern while preserving very old inequalities. In that sense, everyday life in 1950s Las Vegas held a contradiction that belonged not only to Nevada, but to post-war America more broadly. The nation celebrated progress in appliances, roads, suburban housing, entertainment technologies, and military power, while often refusing to extend that progress evenly across social lines. Las Vegas concentrated that contradiction until it became difficult to ignore. The city's relationship with mobility also revealed something deeper. Cars were everywhere, but cars did more than move bodies. They separated experiences. A guest could travel in air-conditioned comfort from hotel entrance to showroom to roadside attraction with very little contact with the city's harsher textures. A worker's drive might connect a modest house, a service entrance, a grocery stop, and a school pickup in a very different emotional register. Teenagers experienced freedom through cruising, while adults experienced necessity through commuting. The same roads connected different versions of the city that did not always fully meet. Las Vegas was unified by movement but divided by what that movement meant. Even sound worked this way. In postcard memory, the city sounds like lounge music, slot machines, clinking glasses, and laughter. In everyday life, it also sounded like vacuum cleaners in hallways, trucks reversing at delivery docks, swamp coolers rattling, radios on in kitchens, children in schoolyards, construction machinery at new developments, and the low murmur of exhausted conversation at dawn coffee counters. The true soundscape of 1950s Las Vegas was not purely glamorous. It was industrial, domestic, commercial, and intimate all at once. It was a city in which pleasure and maintenance were always audible near each other, and sometimes the line between them blurred in curious ways. Consider the cocktail itself, one of the most familiar symbols of mid-century Las Vegas. To the visitor, it represented release, sophistication, leisure. To the waitress carrying it, it represented weight, balance, timing, shoes chosen for endurance rather than comfort, and a night measured partly in tips. To the bar manager, it represented inventory, spoilage, staffing, and turnover. To the city as a whole, it represented a successful conversion of labor into atmosphere. Much of Las Vegas worked like that. A single glittering object, seen up close, turned out to be a small machine connecting many different social realities. The same could be said of the swimming pool, another image often associated with 1950s desert glamour. In photographs, pools signaled modern luxury and climatic triumph. They looked cool, spacious, and effortless against the heat. But in practice they required water, cleaning, filtration, labor, and a social code about who belonged where and how one should behave there. For tourists, a pool could feel like freedom. For staff, it was another site of upkeep. For local children who glimpsed or occasionally accessed such places, it could represent a world tantalizingly close and socially distant at once. Las Vegas specialized in these layered spaces, where one person's ease rested visibly on another person's effort. By now, the city was also becoming more tightly connected to national circuits of entertainment and business. This mattered because it gradually changed who had influence. Earlier forms of local knowledge and informal maneuvering did not disappear, but they began to share space with larger capital, broader publicity strategies, and more systematic thinking about how the city should look and feel to outsiders. The result was not just physical growth, but cultural calibration. Las Vegas was learning to refine itself as a product. That process touched everything from architecture to menu design to staffing decisions to local politics. Local politics, in turn, were never separate from everyday life. Questions about infrastructure, policing, schooling, utilities, development, and civic image all landed in very practical ways on residents' daily routines. Could roads keep up with growth? Could neighborhoods secure enough services? Would schools expand fast enough? Who got investment and who waited? Who could shape the city's future and who merely adapted to it? These were not abstract matters. They determined how comfortable, secure, and durable ordinary life in Las Vegas could become. A city may be famous for what happens at night, but it is governed by what gets built, funded, neglected, and enforced during the day. And still, perhaps the most quietly distinctive feature of life there was psychological. Las Vegas encouraged selective attention. People learned what to look at and what not to dwell on. Tourists learned to look at the lights and not the loading dock. Residents learned to appreciate opportunity while discounting instability. Workers learned to notice moods before problems. Families learned to normalize odd schedules, public contradictions, and a local economy that could feel generous one month and anxious the next. In this sense, everyday life in 1950s Las Vegas was not only about living in the desert or working in tourism. It was about learning to inhabit a city built on managed illusion without entirely being fooled by it. That required a particular kind of realism. Not cynicism exactly, because many people truly loved the city and felt proud of what it was becoming, but realism nonetheless. Residents understood that behind every burst of glamour was a question of cost, and behind every story of easy money was a quieter story about labor, timing, and survival. They also understood that the city's reputation, however exaggerated, had power, could draw opportunity, could draw talent, could also trap people inside expectations they had not chosen. To say you were from Las Vegas in the 1950s was to inherit a narrative already half-written by other people. And as the decade moved on, that narrative was becoming more durable. The city was no longer just rising, it was crystallizing. Its symbols were settling into place. Its economic logic was growing firmer. Its neighborhoods were deepening. Its inequalities were hardening in some areas even as its confidence expanded. The Las Vegas that later generations would inherit as icon was, by the end of the 1950s, becoming legible enough that residents could begin to sense a new question forming beneath the old one. Not simply what the city was, but what it would demand from those who lived inside its image as it entered the next era. That demand would become easier to see as Las Vegas moved toward the turn of the decade, because by then the city was no longer merely persuading the country to notice it. It was beginning to understand that being noticed could change the internal texture of ordinary life just as surely as growth, climate, or wages ever had. A place that becomes famous does not stay entirely private to itself. Its streets, routines, and expectations begin to bend around the fact that it is being watched. In Las Vegas, that meant the local and the theatrical were becoming harder to separate, not only on the Strip, but in neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and civic ambitions. One of the quietest changes was in confidence. Early boomtown confidence has an improvised quality to it. People say yes quickly. They take chances. They assume that tomorrow will be larger than today and that any rough edges can be smoothed later. But mature confidence is different. It demands maintenance. It wants proof, planning, continuity, and image control. By the late 1950s, Las Vegas was beginning to move from the first kind to the second. And whenever that happens in a fast-growing place, everyday life changes in subtle but important ways. Workers discover that improvisation is less tolerated. Local leaders become more protective of reputation. Investors ask different questions. Neighborhoods become more clearly sorted. Families who once felt they were living in a place of open possibility begin to notice that the city now has a memory, and that memory can include hierarchies. Hierarchies in Las Vegas had always existed, but a younger city can sometimes hide them behind motion. When everything is expanding, people can imagine that they are simply one good year away from a better life. Expansion encourages hope because it creates many points of entry. A growing hotel needs staff. A new neighborhood needs shops. A busier town needs mechanics, delivery drivers, barbers, teachers, nurses, and clerks. Yet as the city became more established, those openings did not vanish, but they became more structured. A worker might still rise, but increasingly within a system rather than around it. That distinction mattered. It changed how people understood ambition. Success in Las Vegas had once seemed to belong to the bold. It was beginning to belong more clearly to those who could navigate institutions, appearances, and alliances. For local residents, the idea of permanence grew more attractive precisely because so much in the city still felt fluid. Churches expanded. Schools adjusted. More families spoke not just of coming to Las Vegas, but of staying there. That may sound simple, but in a city shaped by transience, staying is a kind of statement. It means investing not only in wages, but in roads, parks, classrooms, and neighborhood reputations. It means imagining old age in a place the nation still sees as a perpetual performance. In this way, one of the least flashy features of 1950s Las Vegas was also one of the most revealing. Ordinary people were trying to turn a town famous for temporary pleasures into a place durable enough for long lives. They did that through small routines repeated over years. School lunches packed before dawn because a parent would be gone by evening. Church clothes brushed clean on Saturday night. Cars checked carefully because a missed shift could matter. Bills arranged in drawers. Window shades adjusted against afternoon heat. Birthday cakes made at home even if dazzling desserts glittered a few miles away in hotel dining rooms. This is where everyday history becomes more honest than legend. Legends remember the marquee. Everyday life remembers the ironing board, the grocery list, the slow accumulation of furniture, and the practiced art of stretching energy across a workweek that did not behave like other American workweeks. The city's domestic interiors, in particular, tell a quieter story than its neon exteriors. Mid-century homes in Las Vegas often projected modest modernity. Low horizontal lines, practical rooms, light materials, appliances that suggested ease even when budgets made ease partial rather than complete. In national advertising, the post-war home was often presented as a machine for comfort. In the Las Vegas desert, comfort was more conditional. Air cooling helped, but heat still governed behavior. Dust still found its way in. Lawns looked admirable because they were difficult. Shade was valuable because it remained limited. Residents learned to live seasonally in a place whose postcard image often pretended that the climate itself had been conquered. It had not, of course. The desert remained the city's oldest fact. Summer shaped tempers, schedules, and physical endurance. Water carried a kind of moral weight because everyone understood, at least in practice, that it meant life, cost, and infrastructure. A fountain on a resort property was not merely decorative. It was a statement of power over environment. So was a green patch of suburban grass. So was a cool hotel lobby in the middle of a brutal afternoon. Las Vegas sold fantasy partly by making environmental control look effortless. Residents knew better. They saw the repair crews, the utility dependents, the systems behind the coolness. In that sense, to live there was to understand that the city's elegance was built not against reality, but through a continuous struggle with it. That struggle touched the body directly. Skin dried out, lips cracked, cars became ovens in the sun. Walking was measured carefully. Children learned quickly which surfaces could burn. Workers in kitchens, garages, and outdoor jobs carried the climate differently from tourists moving between air-conditioned interiors. And this is another place where the mythology softens something more difficult. To experience 1950s Las Vegas fully was not simply to be entertained. It was to be physically managed by the desert even while the city insisted that everything remained under control. The city's poise, then, had a certain strain in it. Beneath the lounge music was the constant fact of adaptation. Adaptation also defined leisure for residents. It is tempting to assume that living in Las Vegas meant living inside entertainment, but locals, like people anywhere, often preferred forms of relaxation that offered relief from their work environment rather than a continuation of it. Someone who spent all night under bright lights and in cigarette smoke might not want more spectacle on a day off. He might want quiet, shade, a backyard chair, a drive, a modest dinner, or a few hours in a living room with the television on. A waitress who spent her shift being warmly attentive might treasure privacy more than excitement. This is a useful reversal. The city famous for stimulation often taught its residents to value calm. Still, the city could not help shaping what calm looked like. A drive at dusk, for example, had a distinct Las Vegas quality. The horizon stayed wide. The edges of the built world gave way quickly. The transition between developed streets and open desert remained much more immediate than in older American cities. One could leave behind traffic, signs, and parking lots and feel, within minutes, a different scale of silence. That closeness between noise and emptiness gave ordinary life in Las Vegas an almost tidal rhythm. Activity surged, but the land around it remained vast enough to make human ambition seem temporary. Perhaps that is one reason the city often felt slightly unreal even to those who lived there. Its man-made brilliance stood so close to a landscape that had no use for it. If that created wonder, it also created vulnerability. Boomtowns depend on confidence, and confidence can be fragile. Residents knew this whether or not they put it into words. They knew that visitor traffic mattered. They knew that management changes mattered. They knew that a resort opening could shift jobs and expectations across the city, and that a poor run of business could turn glamorous surfaces anxious very quickly. In such a place, stability had to be built deliberately. That helps explain the seriousness with which many families approached conventional respectability. Neat homes, proper dress, church attendance, school participation, savings if possible, reliable vehicles, good local standing. These things were not simply imitations of national post-war ideals. In Las Vegas, they were defenses against uncertainty. This did not make the city morally straightforward. Respectability in Las Vegas often coexisted with quiet accommodation. A parent might prefer a more conventional town in theory while depending entirely on casino wages in practice. A civic leader might praise family life while understanding that the local tax base drew heavily on gambling and adult leisure. A minister might preach restraint to a congregation containing cocktail servers, dealers, lounge staff, and hotel workers whose livelihoods depended on settings built around indulgence. Such contradictions did not always create open conflict. More often, they created a local habit of compartmentalizing, of letting parallel realities stand beside one another without demanding constant resolution. That habit could make the city seem tolerant from one angle and evasive from another. Las Vegas often allowed people to reinvent themselves, or at least to emphasize certain parts of themselves while leaving others less examined. That was part of its attraction. Yet the same culture could be quite watchful in local terms. Neighborhoods noticed behavior. Workplaces noticed appearance. Gossip moved quickly. A city can offer anonymity to visitors while denying it to residents, and 1950s Las Vegas did exactly that. The guest could disappear into atmosphere. The worker went home to a community where names, habits, and family circumstances were easier to track. So the freedom the city advertised was real, but unevenly distributed and often temporary. This is particularly important when thinking about women's lives in the city. The public image of femininity in Las Vegas was polished, visible, and often highly stylized. But most local women lived a more complex reality balancing work, family management, heat, household maintenance, and social expectations that remained recognizably mid-century American. Some worked in glamorous environments without living glamorous lives. Others worked entirely outside the tourist world while still carrying the city's reputation on their shoulders. A woman in Las Vegas might be assumed by outsiders to belong to a world of nightlife and display simply because of where she lived, even if her daily life was defined by school pickups, shopping, clerical work, church duties, or nursing shifts. At the same time, the city could offer forms of economic participation that were meaningful. Hospitality, retail, clerical work, and service employment created opportunities, though not equally or without limits. Many women developed a hard practical competence precisely because the city's economy demanded it. They managed irregular domestic timing, budgets exposed to tip variability, wardrobes for public-facing jobs, and family routines shaped by the mismatch between tourist hours and household needs. Their labor, like so much labor in Las Vegas, was often made to disappear into atmosphere. Yet without it, the city's polished image would have fractured almost immediately. Children, too, had to learn the city's double language. They inhabited a hometown the outside world already imagined in exaggerated terms, while their own lives remained full of ordinary textures. Scraped knees, school assignments, church events, neighborhood games, hand-me-down clothes, bicycles left in yards, and the boredom of hot afternoons. But they also grew up unusually close to adult performance. They saw signage, nightlife districts, dressed-up visitors, and tired parents in uniforms. They learned, perhaps earlier than children elsewhere, that the world had fronts and back rooms. Not necessarily in a sinister way, though sometimes that too, but in the broader sense that much of adult life involved staging, concealment, and emotional control. The educational system had to serve this growing, unusual population while the city itself kept changing around it. Teachers were not only teaching arithmetic and reading, they were helping stabilize a community under rapid expansion. In fast-growing places, schools become anchors of identity. They reassure families that a city built quickly can still produce continuity. Yet expansion also brought strain. Crowded classrooms, uneven resources, and the perpetual challenge of keeping public institutions at pace with private development. The glamorous city in national magazines depended on a quieter city of underappreciated administrators, teachers, custodians, bus drivers, and parents trying to make ordinary structures hold. The same was true in medicine and public health. A city devoted to pleasure still required clinics, hospitals, dental offices, pharmacies, and practical care for people whose work could be physically demanding. The body behind the smile, the feet behind the polished uniform, the lungs behind the cigarette haze, the sleeplessness behind the smooth greeting. These realities accumulated. Everyday life in Las Vegas was not only about entertainment and tourism, but about where. A city awake late places special pressure on the people who must sustain its wakefulness. In a calmer town, fatigue disperses more evenly. In Las Vegas, fatigue often concentrated in the very people least celebrated by the public image of the place. And that image was becoming more national, more exportable, more self-aware. Advertising did not simply describe Las Vegas. It refined it. Photographs cropped out the ordinary. Promotions emphasized ease, novelty, romance, and sophistication. The city increasingly learned to tell a story about itself that outsiders wanted to hear. This brought money and attention, but it also subtly disciplined reality. Once a place has a marketable image, local decisions begin to serve that image. Streets are improved where visitors will see them first. Investments cluster where prestige is most legible. Inconvenient truths are pushed to the edges. Everyday life then becomes a negotiation between how a city is sold and how it is actually lived. No part of that negotiation was more revealing than race. As the city's national image sharpened, its exclusions became more conspicuous for those willing to look closely. Segregation in housing and unequal access to the city's benefits were not accidents of growth. They were structured into everyday geography. West Las Vegas developed strong community institutions under pressure, but the pressure itself remained unjust. Black residents contributed labor, culture, style, and resilience to the city, while confronting barriers that the mythology of glamorous freedom preferred not to mention. The uncomfortable truth was that Las Vegas marketed openness while practicing significant forms of closure. Yet even here, the story is not flat. Pressure produces response. Community life in West Las Vegas was not merely reactive. It generated its own businesses, social worlds, faith communities, and forms of dignity. People built lives under conditions they had not chosen. Musicians, workers, families, entrepreneurs, and local leaders made something durable in the face of unequal treatment. To understand everyday life honestly, one has to hold both facts at once. The injustice was real, and so was the creativity with which people lived inside and against it. History becomes more trustworthy when it refuses to trade one truth for the other. There is also a larger irony here. Las Vegas liked to imagine itself as modern because it looked modern. Neon, chrome, air conditioning, publicity, themed architecture, showrooms, and bold signage all spoke the language of the future. But a future-looking surface can coexist very comfortably with old patterns of inequality, labor extraction, and moral contradiction. In that sense, the city was not unusual at all. It was, perhaps, an especially vivid American mirror. It showed how a society could celebrate innovation while leaving deeper questions unresolved. It showed how comfort and exclusion could share a boulevard. It showed how leisure could depend on invisible exhaustion. As the 1950s gave way to the threshold of the next decade, residents were living inside that mirror every day. They saw the city becoming more polished and more famous, but they also felt what it cost to sustain that transformation. They felt it in work rules, rents, long shifts, changing neighborhoods, and the increasing weight of a public image that now seemed likely to follow Las Vegas permanently. The city had once been a destination becoming a community. It was now becoming an icon, and icons are rarely easy places in which to live ordinary lives. That is where the deeper tension begins to sharpen. Because once Las Vegas understood its own symbolic power, the city's future would no longer depend only on casinos, visitors, or weathering the desert. It would depend on whether the people who cooked, cleaned, dealt, drove, taught, prayed, raised children, and built neighborhoods could continue to make a real life inside a place that was increasingly tempted to value image over texture, spectacle over memory, and growth over balance. And that question, still forming at the edge of daily life, would become even harder to ignore as a new decade arrived with bigger ambitions, broader publicity, and a city already preparing to become something larger than its own residents had first imagined. Those bigger ambitions did not arrive in abstract form. They appeared in concrete, glass, carpeting, payroll systems, bigger parking lots, broader roads, larger signs, more carefully managed entertainment, and a city increasingly aware that its own name had become a commercial asset. Once that happens, everyday life begins to reorganize itself around scale. A place that once felt like a rapidly growing town with a remarkable tourist district starts to feel, instead, like a branded environment whose local population must learn to live inside a permanent performance. For longtime residents, or even those who had arrived only a decade earlier, this could produce a subtle unease. The city they had helped build through labor and routine was still recognizably theirs, but it was also becoming something slightly less intimate. Familiar businesses could disappear. Informal arrangements could harden into policy. Local knowledge, once enough to navigate opportunity, had to share space with a more formal culture of management, investment, and public relations. Las Vegas had not stopped being human-sized, but it was beginning to act like a city that expected to be seen from far away. That is a different way of existing, and it changes the feel of even the most ordinary morning. A morning in Las Vegas at the edge of the 1960s still began, as so many had before, with work. The city's glamour was nocturnal, but its maintenance was dawn-bound. Delivery men came through service entrances before tourists fully woke. Maids moved methodically through hotel corridors. Cooks began again. Accountants and clerks handled the less visible side of the dream. Receipts, wages, inventories, contracts, bookings, and schedules. Meanwhile, in residential neighborhoods, parents packed lunches, started cars, checked on uniforms, and negotiated the peculiar household choreography that the city's labor economy required. Some adults were leaving for daytime jobs in schools, offices, or shops. Others were only just coming home, bringing with them the stale sweetness of cigarette smoke, the ache of long hours on their feet, and the practiced silence of people who needed sleep while the sun was climbing. That household silence was one of the less glamorous signatures of Las Vegas life. In other American towns, daytime suggested activity. In many Las Vegas homes, it also meant protection for the sleeper. Curtains remained drawn. Children were reminded to keep their voices low. Doors were shut softly. Radios were lowered. The city's service economy had a way of reversing the emotional meaning of the clock. Daylight was not only a beginning, could also be the fragile edge of someone else's end. Families adapted, and adaptation gradually became normal, but there is a difference between what becomes normal and whatever becomes easy. It is worth lingering there, because this is where the city becomes most understandable. Much of the mythology of Las Vegas is built on excess, but the everyday experience of living there often depended on careful management. Of time, of money, of exhaustion, of appearances, and of temperature. The city was famous for abundance, yet many families built their lives through precision. Budgets had to account for irregular tips, slow weeks, surprise repairs, and growing children. Groceries had to be planned. Cars had to keep running. Clothing had to last even when some jobs demanded polished presentation. A town of luminous surfaces could still be, at the level of the household, a place of frugality. And frugality in the desert carried its own particular habits. Cooling cost money. Water mattered. Dust returned no matter how often it was pushed away. Homeownership, where possible, was a source not only of pride but of labor. A lawn in Las Vegas was not just a lawn. It was an argument against the environment, and like many arguments against the environment, it required persistent maintenance. The same could be said for shade trees, flower beds, swimming pools, and freshly painted exteriors. In a milder climate, such things could look natural. In Las Vegas, they looked like effort, whether people said so or not. That effort extended to the city's public face. The larger Las Vegas became, the more carefully it had to conceal the work beneath its own image. Visitors were supposed to encounter excitement, not logistics. They were meant to glide through lobbies, cocktail lounges, dining rooms, gaming floors, and showrooms without thinking very much about the kitchens below, the laundry rooms behind, the service tunnels, the waste, the deliveries, the repair crews, the payroll office, or the women and men whose labor made every polished surface briefly seem effortless. Residents, by contrast, lived with both versions of the city at once. They knew the front and the back. They understood that one existed only because the other never stopped. This double awareness shaped the emotional tone of daily life. Locals could enjoy the beauty of the city's spectacle while being less susceptible to its claims. They knew that glamour was real as an effect. They could see it, hear it, even feel it at moments. But they also knew it was manufactured. This is different from saying it was fake. Manufactured things can be quite real. A beautifully staged lounge, a carefully designed resort, a polished performance, a late-night dining room with perfect lighting and quietly moving staff. These were real experiences. They were simply not spontaneous. They had been built and rehearsed and cleaned and paid for. One of the quiet forms of wisdom among Las Vegas residents was learning to live without confusing atmosphere with truth. Children learned that too, though in less explicit language. Growing up in Las Vegas meant growing up with a strange proximity to fantasy, while also being surrounded by adults who were too tired, too practical, or too financially alert to be fooled by it for long. A child might see spectacular signs and nationally known performers, yet also know that his mother had blistered feet from a shift, or that his father needed the house silent all afternoon, or that the family could not afford the world they helped sustain for strangers. This did not necessarily breed bitterness. Often it produced sharpness. Children in such environments sometimes develop an early sense of how image and reality coexist. They learn that adults smile when tired, dress well when worried, and speak optimistically while calculating constantly in private. That quiet sophistication existed across the city, though unevenly and under very different conditions. In white middle and working-class neighborhoods, it might appear as a practical acceptance of the city's contradictions. In black neighborhoods, especially West Las Vegas, the double awareness often had a sharper edge, because residents were being asked not merely to sustain the city's image, but to do so while navigating exclusion from many of its rewards. By the turn of the decade, these inequalities were not hidden in any meaningful sense to those living inside them. They structured housing, access, movement, expectations, and the very geography of comfort. To say that everyday life was different in different parts of Las Vegas is not enough. The city's glamour was distributed through unequal doors, and yet the city remained interconnected. Domestic workers, porters, entertainers, musicians, maids, drivers, servers, dealers, cooks, clerks, teachers, mechanics, and shopkeepers all participated in a shared urban rhythm, even when their rights and opportunities differed sharply. This is part of what made Las Vegas so socially revealing. It concentrated different worlds close together. A wealthy visitor, a famous performer, a casino manager, a cocktail waitress, and a child from a modest neighborhood might all move through the same broad city on the same day while experiencing entirely different versions of it. In older or larger cities, such layers can remain more diffuse. In Las Vegas, the compactness of the place made the layers visible. This compactness also intensified reputation. People knew who worked where. They knew who had been promoted, who had left town, who was rumored to be struggling, who had bought a house, whose child was doing well in school, who had found a steady spot in a difficult industry, who had married into stability, and who seemed to be slipping. Modern viewers sometimes imagine Las Vegas as anonymous because it was built around tourism. In daily local life, it was often the opposite. The city could be intimate enough to feel almost over-aware of itself. That intimacy was reassuring for some and suffocating for others. It helped produce community, but it also made reinvention more complicated once one had actually settled there. The city's entertainment economy, meanwhile, was changing in tone. Earlier glamour had carried some of the rough improvisation of a boomtown. Increasingly, it carried the polish of a national product. Showrooms became more tightly integrated into the logic of resorts. Entertainment was not merely there for prestige. It was there to shape traffic, extend stays, reinforce branding, and make the entire resort experience feel complete. This mattered to workers because more polished entertainment environments often produced stricter backstage systems. Timing, behavior, dress, and presentation were all more tightly linked to revenue. As Las Vegas grew, performance in the broadest sense became more measured. A city that sold ease was becoming more disciplined behind the curtain. This same discipline could be felt in food service. The classic image is generous. Cocktails circulating, steaks arriving, coffee poured at almost any hour, desserts glowing softly under restaurant lights. But the real achievement was organizational. Las Vegas had to feed people according to the logic of leisure, not the logic of ordinary domestic time. That meant meals late at night, breakfasts at unusual hours, staff kitchens operating on practical clocks while guests moved on emotional ones, and a constant need to keep abundance appearing natural. A visitor might feel that food simply appeared. A worker knew how much coordination stood behind that appearance. Here again, the city's magic depended on never letting the mechanism show. Even transportation carried this dual quality. Las Vegas was a car city, but not simply because Americans loved cars. Cars in Las Vegas were tools of survival, insulation, aspiration, and status all at once. They got workers to shifts that did not align with public convenience. They shielded bodies from heat. They marked class position. They supported suburban expansion. They allowed families to build ordinary lives beyond walking distance from the tourism core. At the same time, they helped visitors skim the city's surface. A tourist could arrive, park, move from spectacle to spectacle, and leave with very little sense of the neighborhoods or labor systems that made the city function. The automobile was one of the great instruments by which Las Vegas separated lived reality from curated experience. If one stepped away from that curated experience, though, the city revealed itself quickly. Strip away the signs, and there was still a desert town dealing with growth. Roads needed work. Schools needed expansion. Water and utilities required planning. Hospitals and clinics had to meet demand. New homes needed services. Not every corner looked polished. Not every district benefited equally from investment. Construction remained part of the atmosphere. So did incompletion. This is important because cities in legend often look finished. Cities in life are rarely finished. 1950s Las Vegas, even at its most dazzling, still had exposed edges. Those exposed edges could produce a certain toughness in residents. Not theatrical toughness, but everyday competence. People learned to cope with heat, odd hours, long distances by foot, dust, financial uncertainty, and the soft unpredictability of an economy tied so heavily to visitor mood. They learned not to panic at fluctuations that would have seemed alarming elsewhere. They learned that the city could look smooth at night and feel vulnerable by morning. They learned that success could be visible and unstable at the same time. Such environments produce a particular type of realism. Alert, unsentimental, but not necessarily joyless. There was joy too, and it should not be dismissed. Families still celebrated. Children still played. Couples still made plans. Residents still felt pride when the city grew more beautiful or better known. Locals sometimes enjoyed the very entertainments their labor sustained, especially when access or cost allowed it. There were dances, church gatherings, dinners out, drives, holiday decorations, school events, swimming, music on the radio, and all the other small forms of happiness that make a life feel inhabited rather than merely endured. The mistake would be to flatten Las Vegas into either glitter or hardship. It was both more ordinary and more unusual than either version suggests. Perhaps one of the strangest features of living there was the nearness of national history. The atomic age, the Cold War, the transformation of American consumer culture, the rise of television celebrity, suburban expansion, civil rights pressure, new forms of corporate influence, and changing ideas of leisure all touched Las Vegas with unusual visibility. A resident could experience huge national changes not only through newspapers and radio or television, but through the changing texture of the city itself. New resort styles, new visitors, new music, new rules, new tensions, new expectations about race and respectability, new promotional language, new forms of scale. These were not abstractions. They were the local weather of history. That proximity to change could make the city feel modern in an almost intoxicating way. Las Vegas did not merely participate in post-war America. It often seemed to stage post-war America back to itself in heightened form. It displayed mobility, consumption, brightness, confidence, and managed pleasure as if these were the natural goals of modern life. But that display also concealed dependence. On workers, on infrastructure, on unequal arrangements, on environmental control, on constant repair. The city's greatest trick may have been to turn dependence into style. And style, once successful, hardens into expectation. Residents increasingly understood that the city would now be expected to shine. That expectation could be profitable, but it could also be burdensome. A resort could not easily become modest. A city famous for spectacle could not afford too much visible fatigue. Yet fatigue remained everywhere in the lives of the people holding it up. One of the more poignant truths about everyday life in late 1950s Las Vegas is that it required ordinary people to protect an atmosphere of ease that they themselves were often too tired to enjoy fully. This did not go unnoticed among locals. People talked, compared, adjusted, and judged. They knew which places treated staff better, which schedules were punishing, which neighborhoods felt settled, which remained precarious, which schools were improving, which managers were difficult, which jobs looked glamorous from outside and miserable from within. Such local knowledge created an unofficial map of the city, one quite different from the one sold to tourists. It was a map made of effort, reputation, caution, and opportunity. To belong to Las Vegas was to read that map fluently. As the city prepared to enter the next decade, that map was becoming more complicated. The old logic of a desert outpost transformed by gambling and tourism had not disappeared, but it was being layered over by something larger. A city increasingly conscious of itself as an American symbol. Symbols attract money. They also attract pressure. Once Las Vegas became a shorthand for glamour, risk, pleasure, and nighttime freedom, it had to keep reproducing those meanings, even when local life was asking for schools, stable neighborhoods, fairer treatment, quieter mornings, and a little more room to breathe. And that is where the next turn in the story begins. Because the arrival of the 1960s would not simply mean more of the same with taller signs and larger crowds. It would bring sharper struggles over race, belonging, labor, image, and power, all inside a city that had spent the 1950s learning how to turn itself into a fantasy. The question now was what happened when the people living behind that fantasy began, more openly and more forcefully, to insist on being seen as something other than scenery for the American dream. that insistence did not always begin with grand speeches or dramatic confrontation. More often, it began in the ordinary friction of daily life, in where a person could sit, where a family could buy a home, which entrance a worker used, which neighborhoods received investment, who was expected to smile and who was allowed to belong. In Las Vegas, as in much of the United States, the new decade did not create these tensions. It made them harder to keep hidden beneath the language of growth and glamour. For Black residents in particular, the contradiction had long been obvious. The city liked to market itself as open, modern, and lightly liberated from the stricter manners of older America. Yet much of that supposed openness had been selective, profitable, and carefully bounded. A performer could be welcomed on stage and restricted off it. A worker could help create a luxurious evening for visitors while returning home to streets that received less attention and fewer resources. A city famous for offering escape could still deny ordinary dignity to many of the people whose labor made that escape possible. The friction between image and lived reality was becoming too sharp to ignore. What makes Las Vegas especially revealing at this moment is that the city's racial order sat inside a place so committed to performance. In some towns, inequality could hide behind the plainness of daily life. In Las Vegas, it existed beside chandeliers, bright marquees, polished dining rooms, and nationally advertised entertainment. That proximity made the contradiction feel almost theatrical in itself. The city projected one story to the country and enforced another at home. And because the place was still relatively compact, the distance between those two stories could be measured not in abstract policy but in streets, neighborhoods, workplaces, and nightly routines. West Las Vegas remained at the center of that reality. It was a community shaped by exclusion, but not defined only by deprivation. Churches, local businesses, clubs, schools, homes, and social networks sustained a sense of belonging under unequal conditions. People built family life, found ways to celebrate, organized mutual support, and created civic culture where they could. Children still rode bicycles, adults still dressed carefully for church or work, meals were still prepared, bills still paid, hopes still invested in schools and steady employment. The daily reality was not an endless scene of hardship. It was ordinary life lived with the added burden of structural limits. That distinction matters because dignity often survives precisely where systems fail to provide fairness. At the same time, those limits shaped almost everything. They shaped how far certain wages could go, what a home might look like, how long a commute might take, where a child grew up seeing possibility and where he learned caution first. In cities, power often appears first as geography. One district gets smoother roads, better lighting, stronger services, newer investment. Another receives the leftovers of attention. Las Vegas was no exception. To understand everyday life there honestly, one has to notice not only the bright center of the tourist economy, but the unequal map supporting it. The city's famous hospitality rested on a much less hospitable civic arrangement. Yet the early 1960s also brought pressure from outside and inside the city that made older arrangements more difficult to preserve untouched. The broader civil rights movement was reshaping the moral atmosphere of the country. Television, national newspapers, and shifting public arguments were changing what local officials and business interests could comfortably defend. Las Vegas may have liked to think of itself as exceptional, but it was not outside the United States. National changes reached it, and once they did, local contradictions became more costly to maintain, not only ethically but economically and symbolically. That last point is important. Las Vegas depended on image. This meant that moral questions were rarely just moral questions. They were also questions of publicity, business confidence, civic reputation, and national perception. A city built on attracting visitors could not entirely separate civil rights from commercial strategy. If the nation increasingly associated modernity with a certain language of fairness, Then old exclusions began to look less like tradition and more like bad management of the future. This did not mean that business leaders suddenly became principled reformers. More often, it meant that economics and justice began uneasily to intersect. For ordinary residents, these shifts could feel distant and immediate at the same time. The language of rights may have appeared in headlines and speeches, but it was experienced locally through work assignments, housing patterns, neighborhood confidence, and the basic question of whether the city one helped sustain would ever fully recognize one's claim to it. Everyday history lives in such thresholds. It is not only in landmark decisions, but in the daily moment when people begin to understand that the rules around them are not eternal. This period also revealed something else about Las Vegas. The city's dependence on labor made it more vulnerable to pressure than its glamorous surfaces suggested. A resort can market fantasy, but it cannot function without cooks, porters, waitresses, cleaners, musicians, technicians, clerks, cashiers, mechanics, and drivers. Once workers and communities become more conscious of that dependence, the balance of power subtly changes. Not completely and not quickly, but enough to matter. Even a city built on illusion has to reckon with the practical fact that beds must be made, food must arrive, floors must be cleaned, and guests must be served. Everyday labor gives ordinary people leverage, even when official narratives try to keep that leverage out of sight. Meanwhile, white residents living outside the city's most visible injustices were also negotiating change, though in different ways. Many wanted stability more than confrontation. They wanted neighborhoods to feel respectable, jobs to remain secure, schools to improve, and the city's prosperity to continue without public embarrassment. That impulse could lead to genuine moderation in some cases and evasive caution in others. One of the defining habits of mid-century Las Vegas was the wish to preserve comfort while minimizing conflict. But history rarely offers that bargain for long. A city can postpone tensions through compartmentalization, but once they begin to cross district lines and public narratives, they tend to demand clearer choices. The city's hospitality economy complicated those choices further because it trained people to avoid visible friction. Workers were rewarded for calm, for smooth handling, for emotional control, for making difficulty disappear into service. Managers preferred continuity. Tourists preferred not to witness social strain. Civic boosters preferred stories of growth, elegance, and modern progress. In such an environment, demands for fairness could be treated not only as political challenges, but as interruptions to atmosphere. This gave Las Vegas a particular style of resistance to change. Not always loud, but often evasive, managerial, and deeply invested in keeping conflict backstage. Backstage, of course, was where much of the city's truth already lived. The public-facing Las Vegas of ads and postcards was only one layer of the urban experience. Behind the dining rooms were kitchens. Behind the smiles were tired workers. Behind the polished resort entrances were service corridors, loading docks, and break rooms where the city looked less like fantasy and more like industry. It is worth noticing how often the real Las Vegas hid in architectural margins. If a person wanted to understand what the city valued, one could look at the showroom. If one wanted to understand how the city worked, one had to follow the carts, the schedules, the uniforms, and the feet of workers disappearing through side doors. Those side doors mattered symbolically as well as practically. They marked the difference between those meant to be seen and those expected to remain functional but invisible. Much of everyday life in Las Vegas turned on that distinction. It shaped work identities. It shaped social confidence. It shaped the city's internal hierarchy of worth. To be public in Las Vegas often meant to be styled, lit, and marketable. To be necessary did not always mean to be visible. And once a city organizes itself that way for long enough, invisibility can start to feel natural to those benefiting from it, even as it feels intolerable to those consigned to it. As the decade advanced, the entertainment culture itself continued changing. Bigger names, more controlled presentations, and a more integrated resort experience made Las Vegas seem increasingly professional, almost frictionless, from the guest's perspective. But professionalism can be a demanding atmosphere to live inside. It turns charm into expectation, beauty into maintenance, and hospitality into measurable performance. Workers had to embody the city's promise, not only support it. That could be tiring in a new way. Earlier roughness had at least allowed for some improvisation. Greater polish narrowed the room for off days, visible frustration, or eccentricity that did not fit the brand. This pressure was not distributed evenly. A headliner and a maid did not carry the city's image in the same way, yet both were part of its machinery. A front desk clerk might feel the strain in posture and voice. A cocktail waitress might feel it in her shoes, her smile, and the need to read tables quickly. A dealer might feel it in the demand for flawless composure under endless repetition. A local shopkeeper might feel it in the way rising expectations about the city rippled outward, affecting customer behavior, rents, and the tone of daily exchange. Las Vegas increasingly asked everyone near its center to help preserve the idea that ease was natural there. And still, outside that managed ease, the city remained a place of domestic compromise. Homes did not stop being modest simply because resorts became grander. Kitchens still held receipts and packed lunches. Children still outgrew clothes. Couples still argued quietly about schedules and money. Cars still needed repair. Dust still crept in. Heat still rearranged afternoons. A town built to suggest indulgence to outsiders still contained thousands of households living lives shaped by routine, thrift, and the careful distribution of energy. This contrast between the public city and the private home may be the most important key to the whole subject. It explains why Las Vegas could feel so dazzling and so ordinary at the same time. Ordinary, however, should not be mistaken for simple. The emotional texture of life there was unusually layered. Pride in the city could coexist with fatigue from serving it. Excitement about growth could coexist with worry about who benefited. Satisfaction in a steady job could coexist with resentment at the conditions attached to it. Families could enjoy the opportunities of the city while disliking the assumptions outsiders made about their home. A child could feel lucky to grow up near famous entertainment while also learning that much of that entertainment was not meant for family life. Las Vegas trained people in complexity. It asked them to hold contradictory truths without always resolving them neatly. That complexity was visible in local aspirations. Many residents did not dream of glamour in the theatrical sense. They dreamed of steadiness. A better house, a cooler bedroom in summer, a safer car, a child doing well in school, a schedule that made family dinners possible once or twice a week, a promotion that did not also erase all remaining leisure. These were not small ambitions. In a city dependent on circulating money and manufactured pleasure, steadiness could be one of the hardest things to secure. It had to be assembled patiently out of wages, habits, and luck. Churches and civic groups continued to matter for precisely this reason. They offered forms of order not controlled by the tourist economy. They gave residents places to be known outside the logic of service. A person might be a waitress on the strip and a choir member on Sunday, a dealer at night and a little league volunteer on a weekday afternoon, a hotel maid and a trusted neighbor, a mechanic and a church deacon, a clerk and a school board parent. These overlapping identities helped keep the city livable. Without them, Las Vegas might have become only an economy. With them, it remained a community, however strained and unequal. And communities remember. As the 1960s moved forward, memory itself became a subtle force in local life. People had lived through the city's rise. They remembered dustier streets, smaller crowds, rougher beginnings, and a time when Las Vegas felt less fixed in national imagination. Such memories could produce nostalgia, but also perspective. They reminded residents that what now looked permanent had once been improvised. That mattered because it suggested that the city could change again. If Las Vegas had been made, then it could be remade. If its glamour was constructed, then so were its exclusions. Once people begin to see institutions as built rather than natural, they become more imaginable as targets of reform. This is part of why the city's next struggles carried such significance. They were not only about local policy or business custom. They were about who had the right to define what Las Vegas was for. Was it primarily a showcase for visitors, investment, and spectacle? Was it a hometown with obligations to the people raising children there and growing old there? Could it be both, and if so, on whose terms? These are not abstract urban questions. They shape pavement, wages, schools, housing, policing, and dignity. They shape whether the city feels like a place one belongs or merely one serves. The deeper irony, of course, is that the city's famous flexibility made it simultaneously adaptable and stubborn. Las Vegas was excellent at redesigning surfaces. It could remodel a resort, refresh a marquee, rebrand a show, or reinvent a public mood with remarkable speed. But changing deeper arrangements, racial inequality, labor hierarchies, the selective distribution of comfort was much harder. This is a pattern worth noticing beyond Las Vegas itself. Societies often find it easier to modernize appearances than structures. The city's history makes that truth unusually visible because appearance there was never a secondary matter. It was the business model. Still, structures do shift when enough pressure gathers. The climate of the broader country, the insistence of local communities, the practical leverage of workers, and the reputational anxieties of a tourism-based city were all beginning to converge. That convergence did not guarantee justice, and it certainly did not promise smooth progress. But it did mean that the old arrangement was entering a more unstable phase. Residents could feel it even before every outcome was clear. The city's surface remained polished, but the terms of who could claim Las Vegas, who could move through it fully, and who would shape its future were no longer as settled as they had once seemed. In the homes, shops, schools, churches, and service corridors of the city, this change was not yet a final break with the old order. It was something subtler and perhaps more historically interesting. A growing awareness that everyday life itself had become political. Not in the loudest sense, but in the practical sense. Where one lived, where one worked, how one was seen, what one endured, what one expected for one's children, what one accepted as normal, and what one no longer wished to accept. These had become central questions in a city that had spent years presenting itself as a polished escape from serious realities. And because Las Vegas was so dependent on keeping its surfaces calm, the next chapter would be shaped not only by open protest or formal negotiation, but by a more intimate struggle over visibility. Who would remain behind the side doors, and who would step into the main room as a full participant in the city's life? Once that question began to press against the routines of everyday Las Vegas, the city could not quite return to the comfortable arrangement it had known in the 1950s. The lights still shone, the cocktails still circulated, the housekeeping carts still rolled at dawn, but the meaning of the city beneath all that motion was beginning to shift in a way that even the brightest signs could no longer completely disguise. That shift in meaning could be felt in the smallest interactions long before it fully announced itself in public memory. A city does not transform only through headline events. It changes when old habits of deference start to feel less automatic, when workers begin comparing conditions more openly, when parents start expecting more for their children than mere endurance, and when a place built on performance discovers that its backstage arrangements are no longer staying backstage. In Las Vegas, the early 1960s carried exactly that atmosphere. Not yet a complete break with the world of the 1950s, but a tightening sense that the city's old balance between glamour and inequality was becoming harder to preserve. Part of what made this so important was the city's dependence on routine. Las Vegas needed the nightly cycle to hold. Guests had to be greeted, rooms turned over, meals served, tables staffed, floors cleaned, music timed, lights maintained, and every layer of the resort world kept in smooth relation to the next. That dependence gave everyday life an almost mechanical regularity, but it also created vulnerability. If enough people within that mechanism began to press for different terms of belonging, the city could not simply ignore them without risking the very atmosphere it sold. The irony was sharp. The more polished Las Vegas became, the more exposed it was to any fracture in the labor and social systems beneath its polish. This was not only true in the resorts. The city's neighborhoods were changing as well. Some parts of Las Vegas were becoming more settled, more suburban in appearance, and more invested in a language of ordinary civic order. Carports, trimmed yards, backyard grills, televisions glowing in living rooms, children carrying schoolbooks home in the dry, late afternoon light. These scenes belonged to the city no less than casino carpets and showroom curtains did. Yet the spread of suburban normalcy often intensified questions of access. Who could buy where, who could borrow on fair terms, who could imagine staying for decades instead of drifting through the city for a few years, and who remained excluded from the full geography of security. In a place that advertised reinvention, permanence itself could become a measure of privilege. Daily shopping made this visible in quiet ways. The grocery store, the pharmacy, the gas station, the department counter, the neighborhood diner. These ordinary spaces reflected the underlying order of the city. Some households moved through them with a sense of growing confidence, as if Las Vegas were finally becoming the respectable, comfortable American city they had hoped it would be. Others moved through the same routines carrying sharper awareness of limits, of which neighborhoods drew investment and which did not, of which children would be assumed promising and which would be assumed peripheral, of who was being welcomed into the city's future and who was being expected merely to service it. Everyday life is often where inequality becomes most legible, precisely because it hides inside ordinary errands. At the same time, Las Vegas still possessed a real power to enchant. That fact should not be dismissed simply because the story contains harder truths. The city at dusk could be undeniably beautiful. Light gathered across signs, hotel facades, and windows in a way that made the desert seem momentarily transformed into something improbable and almost cinematic. For locals driving into work or heading home from a late shift, this beauty could still register, even after years of familiarity. One of the most interesting emotional features of Las Vegas life was that people could know the mechanism intimately and still feel, at moments, the effect of what it produced. Awareness did not entirely cancel wonder. It simply made wonder more complicated. Complication, in fact, may be the most honest word for the city by this stage. A waitress could feel pride in earning well on a good night and resentment at what the job demanded of her body. A family could feel grateful for opportunity and uneasy about the assumptions attached to their city. A black performer could enjoy applause and still experience the humiliation of unequal access. A civic booster could celebrate growth and privately worry about infrastructure, reputation, or unrest. Children could enjoy the novelty of living near a famous landscape while sensing that the adults around them were carrying more strain than the city's image admitted. Las Vegas did not encourage simple feelings. It layered them. That layering could even be heard in language. Residents learned to speak about the city differently depending on context. To outsiders, they might emphasize excitement, famous names, possibility, the unusual character of the place. At home, the conversation might turn to school schedules, parking, bills, management changes, difficult shifts, heat, neighborhood gossip, or the latest rumor about a hotel opening, expansion, or decline. These were not contradictory conversations so much as parallel ones. Las Vegas trained people to move between them fluently. The public city and the private city were always in dialogue, though not always politely. Behind many of these shifts stood money, not in the glamorous sense, but in the organizing sense. Capital was changing the city scale, and scale changes the nature of daily life. When more money concentrates in larger developments, institutions become heavier. Decisions travel farther from the worker on the floor or the family in the neighborhood. A hotel becomes less a local enterprise and more a node in a broader financial and reputational system. This alters everything from hiring culture to design choices to the pace of neighborhood spillover. The city's famous brightness could make it seem improvised forever, but underneath, it was becoming more planned, more leveraged, and more deeply tied to national circuits of investment and entertainment. For workers, that often meant living inside a paradox. As the city became more successful, individual life did not necessarily become less precarious. A spectacular resort could open and create jobs, but those jobs might still be exhausting, emotionally demanding, and unevenly rewarded. A neighborhood could look more stable, yet still be one bad month away from financial strain. The city could project confidence while many households remain dependent on careful budgeting, tip fluctuations, or the physical stamina required to endure long hours in a service economy. This is another of Las Vegas's revealing reversals. Growth did not always reduce uncertainty. Sometimes it simply made uncertainty more expensive. The body continued to bear much of that cost. Long periods on one's feet, cigarette smoke in enclosed spaces, late hours, disrupted sleep, the constant need to appear presentable and attentive, the strain of driving at odd times, the desert's dry air, the pressure of sustained cheerfulness. These things accumulated. Everyday life in Las Vegas was not only an economic system. It was a physical regime. People lived it in their backs, feet, throats, lungs, and nerves. Histories of glamorous cities often understate this bodily dimension, but it matters. A city built for pleasure often outsources discomfort to the people maintaining it. And yet maintenance itself could foster a kind of local pride. There is dignity in competence, especially when that competence sustains something large and difficult. Many residents knew they were part of a city that managed to do something unusual. It fed, housed, entertained, and processed vast numbers of visitors in an environment that had once seemed too harsh and remote for such ambition. Even those critical of Las Vegas's contradictions could feel that it was, in some undeniable sense, impressive. The problem was not that the city had been built. The problem was how unevenly its rewards, recognition, and comforts were distributed once it existed. As these questions intensified, the relationship between the Strip and the rest of Las Vegas grew even more important. For visitors, the Strip often stood in for the whole city. For residents, it was both central and incomplete. It provided employment, taxes, and fame, but it did not exhaust local life. There were still neighborhoods where people knew one another, churches where people gathered for reasons untouched by tourism, school auditoriums with folding chairs and local pride, garages where men repaired engines in the heat, kitchens where families adapted to mismatched schedules, and small businesses that lived or died according to patterns more mundane than glamour. The wider city existed in the shadow of the Strip but was never reducible to it. That shadow, however, affected almost everything. Even domestic aspiration was shaped by it. To own a decent set of furniture, to keep a clean and attractive house, to dress well, to maintain a car, to host a family meal with some sense of grace. These things carried special meaning in a city where public display was everywhere. Respectability in Las Vegas was not only moral. It was aesthetic. Residents were conscious in varying ways of surfaces. Pressed clothes, clean yards, tidy children, polished manners. This was partly a mid-century American pattern more broadly, but in Las Vegas it took on extra force because the whole city lived beside an industry devoted to orchestrated appearances. The line between dignity and display could grow thinner there than elsewhere. For women especially, this could be exhausting. Much of the city's public image rested on polished femininity, but most women's daily lives rested on work. Whether employed directly in hospitality, in clerical roles, in shops, in schools, in healthcare, or mainly within the home, women were often the ones coordinating the city's broken clock at the household level. They packed meals around irregular shifts, preserved calm for sleepers, managed children's schedules, monitored grocery budgets, maintained clothing, and often performed paid labor as well. To outsiders, Las Vegas femininity might look glamorous. Inside the home, it often looked like endurance organized with intelligence. Men, too, inhabited a version of strained performance. Mid-century ideals of masculinity still emphasized steadiness, provision, composure, and practical control. In Las Vegas, men working in hospitality or related service sectors had to combine these expectations with jobs requiring deference, emotional regulation, and adaptation to customer moods. Others in construction, maintenance, transport, or retail navigated a city where physical labor and service labor sat unusually close together. A man might spend his day in a demanding, smoky, highly social environment and still feel expected to embody quiet authority at home. That emotional transition was not always simple. The city's labor systems did not stop at the workplace door. They followed people into family life. Children grew up amid these adult adjustments and learned the city in fragments. They knew which parent needed silence after a night shift. They knew which roads led toward brightness and which toward home. They knew, often without formal explanation, that some spaces in the city belonged more fully to some people than to others. They learned the special boredom of hot afternoons and the peculiar excitement of living in a place that appeared in conversations, films, magazines, and national imagination. They also learned, perhaps sooner than children in calmer towns, that adults could hold several truths at once: pride and fatigue, hope and caution, attraction and disillusionment. School life remained one of the few places where the city attempted, however imperfectly, to convert its rapid growth into continuity. The classroom offered schedules, expectations, progress charts, routines of instruction, and the reassuring repetition of national civic forms. But schools could not stand entirely outside the pressures of the city. They reflected its inequalities, its expansion, and its demographic tensions. Teachers were not merely teaching facts. They were helping children interpret a city that sometimes seemed to have two stories running at once, one of glittering opportunity and one of uneven belonging. That task was never simple, especially as the national climate around race, citizenship, and public life grew more charged. Religion also continued to serve as a stabilizing force, though not in a simplistic way. Churches in Las Vegas were not merely sanctuaries from vice, as older moral narratives might suggest. They were also social infrastructures. They organized meals, offered recognition, created intergenerational continuity, and provided spaces where people could be known for more than their job title or usefulness to the tourism economy. In a city where so much depended on presentation, the church could offer another kind of visibility. Not glamorous, but communal. It is difficult to understand how ordinary residents sustained a sense of self without paying attention to these quieter institutions. At the same time, the city's public appetite for reinvention remained powerful. Las Vegas was becoming more skilled at changing its look without always changing its underlying conditions. New decor could arrive. New stars could perform. New slogans could be coined. A hotel could be refreshed. A facade could be made more modern. But the same workers often remained underneath, carrying the same bodily strain, living with the same civic unevenness, and trying to secure the same fragile forms of domestic steadiness. This is one of the reasons Las Vegas history can feel oddly contemporary even when speaking about the mid-century period. It shows how readily a place can update its image while leaving many underlying tensions intact. Still, tension has a way of accumulating. A city can rely on compartmentalization for only so long before the compartments begin to leak into one another. Tourism, race, labor, housing, schools, image, and neighborhood dignity were no longer separable in the easy way they had once seemed. The people who lived in Las Vegas knew that their daily routines were tied to systems larger than themselves. They could feel changes coming even before those changes had settled into policy or memory. Perhaps that is the truest texture of everyday life on the edge of historical transition. Not certainty, but heightened awareness. By now, even the city's famous nights carried a slightly different undertone. The neon still glowed. Music still drifted through lounges. Glassware still caught the light. Guests still laughed, wagered, flirted, and lingered. Yet for the people sustaining the scene, the atmosphere could feel less innocent than it might have 10 years earlier. Not because glamour had vanished, but because the city's contradictions had become more legible. When one knows too much about the hidden structure of a place, one can still admire it, but never quite in the same uncomplicated way. And the structure itself was preparing to change further. More formal power, more public scrutiny, more social pressure, and a broader national transformation were all converging on a city that had spent years perfecting the art of seeming effortless. For ordinary residents, this would not mean that daily life suddenly ceased to be made of school pickups, grocery runs, shift work, house cleaning, church meetings, neighborhood concerns, and the management of heat and fatigue. It meant that those ordinary things were increasingly taking place inside a city whose next chapter would be argued not only in boardrooms and on stages, but in the basic question of who Las Vegas really belonged to once its people began asking for more than the right to keep it running. That question of belonging had a way of changing the texture of even the most routine day, because once people begin to ask who a city is really for, no errand remains entirely just an errand. The drive to work, the neighborhood school meeting, the church supper, the trip to the grocery store, the conversation over coffee after an overnight shift, all start to carry a slightly sharper awareness of structure. In Las Vegas, that awareness was settling in gradually. Residents did not wake one morning and find the city transformed. Rather, they found themselves looking at familiar things with a more exact eye. The Strip still shimmered. The resorts still promised escape. But more people were noticing the gap between the city's polished welcome and the terms on which many of its own inhabitants were expected to live. This did not make daily life suddenly dramatic. Most mornings still began with ordinary obligations. Someone needed to get children ready for school. Someone needed to sleep while the rest of the house moved carefully around them. Someone needed to be at a service entrance before sunrise. Someone needed to open a shop, fuel a car, count a till, sweep a floor, or answer a telephone. The power of history, especially in a place like Las Vegas, is that it often unfolds while all these modest duties continue. Political change does not wait for ideal conditions. It takes shape inside laundry, behind cash registers, in hallway conversations, in exhaustion, and in the stubborn persistence of people who keep working even while their understanding of the system shifts. By the early 1960s, that shifting understanding was visible in the way residents talked about opportunity. During the 1950s, Las Vegas had often been imagined, by newcomers and boosters alike, as a place where boldness might still be rewarded directly. A person willing to come west, work hard, and stay flexible could believe the city held openings unavailable elsewhere. That belief did not entirely disappear, but it began to sound more qualified. Openings still existed, yet they were easier to see as unevenly distributed. Some were real ladders, others were only revolving doors. A worker could spend years close to glamour without moving much closer to security. A family could live in the orbit of money and still remain one bad stretch of weeks away from strain. This growing realism did not necessarily produce despair. In many cases, it produced strategy. People adjusted. They sought steadier schedules where possible. They chose neighborhoods with care. They watched which employers treated staff better, which parts of town seemed more settled, which schools were developing good reputations, which churches and civic organizations could actually help in practical ways. Everyday life in Las Vegas involved a great deal of reading the city for signs of reliability. Not the reliability promised in brochures, but the quieter reliability of a paycheck that came as expected, a car that kept starting, a landlord who did not raise trouble without warning, a manager whose moods were at least predictable, a street where children could play without too much worry, a friendship network that could absorb an emergency. Reliability, in that sense, became a form of local wealth. This is one of the subtler reversals in the history of Las Vegas. Outsiders saw risk, spectacle, quick fortunes, and the seduction of chance. Residents often valued almost the opposite. They valued steadiness because the city's public face was already so unstable in emotional terms. When one spends each day near people seeking release, excitement, or fantasy, ordinary dependability begins to feel precious. A calm meal at home, a quiet evening without noise, a neighbor one trusts, a regular routine for the children, a church service that asks nothing theatrical of anyone. These could become forms of comfort as meaningful as any show on the Strip, and yet the Strip never stopped exerting its pull, even on those most skeptical of it. That was part of the city's strange genius. The lights and the architecture, the carefully staged coolness inside the resorts, the sense of motion and importance, the knowledge that nationally known performers were nearby and that one's hometown occupied a place in the wider American imagination. These things had emotional force. Residents could criticize the city and still feel proud of it. They could resent what it demanded and still feel, at moments, that they lived somewhere exceptional. Las Vegas was able to produce loyalty even among people who understood its costs unusually well. Perhaps this was because the city offered a type of visibility rare in places of similar size. To live there was to feel, however indirectly, connected to larger currents. National culture passed through town not abstractly, but physically, through entertainers, businessmen, tourists, new promotional styles, changing architecture, expanding roads, and the atmosphere of perpetual reinvention. A schoolchild in Las Vegas might grow up with a stronger sense than many of his peers elsewhere that the wider country was not a distant idea, but something moving directly through his own city every week. The downside of that visibility was that local life could feel overshadowed by national expectation. The upside was that it could make even ordinary residents feel attached to a place of unusual momentum. Momentum, however, can be difficult to live inside for long. A city that is always becoming something larger asks its residents to keep adjusting. Streets change. Employers change. Housing patterns change. Reputations rise and fall. What once felt central becomes outdated. What once felt peripheral becomes suddenly valuable. Families trying to build continuity in such a place often had to work harder than they would have in an older city whose shape was more settled. In Las Vegas, even memory could be unstable because the built environment and the public narrative kept moving so quickly. People who had arrived only 10 or 15 years earlier could already talk about the old days. Not because history was long, but because change had been so compressed. This compression made generational differences especially interesting. Adults who had helped build the city in its rougher, more improvised period often carried a different sensibility from children coming of age in a more polished Las Vegas. Older residents remembered smaller scales, dustier edges, more obvious beginnings. Younger ones increasingly encountered the city as an already famous place, a place with an image to maintain and a mythology attached to it before they were old enough to question it. This could produce subtle tension within households. Parents might speak of practicality, of work, of caution, of not trusting the surface too much. Children, particularly teenagers, might be more attuned to style, celebrity, mobility, and the city's suggestion that life could be lived theatrically if one knew how to carry oneself. Teenage life in Las Vegas reflected the wider American post-war world in some ways and diverged from it in others. Cars, radio, fashion, dating, school events, and the desire for independence all mattered. But the backdrop was distinct. Neon was normal. Visitors were normal. The presence of adult nightlife as part of the ordinary cityscape was normal too, even if teenagers were excluded from much of it directly. This meant that young people grew up close to displays of leisure and sophistication that belonged officially to grown-ups, yet were visible enough to shape aspiration. A teenager cruising in Las Vegas was not merely imitating a national style. He was moving through a city built to dramatize freedom, though always on terms controlled by adults with money. That proximity could make adulthood seem glamorous from a distance and exhausting from close up. Young people saw their parents dressed for shifts, moving in and out of worlds of polished service, nighttime work, and constant fatigue. They also saw the rewards that seemed to shimmer around those worlds. Tips, access, stylish environments, stories, and a sense of being near the center of things. So even within one generation, Las Vegas taught mixed lessons. It warned against illusion and sold it at the same time. It made caution necessary and style useful. It encouraged ambition while also exposing the limits imposed by class, race, gender, and simple bad luck. The city's service culture played a large part in shaping manners more broadly. Because so much work depended on presentation, timing, and emotional control, residents often developed a strong sensitivity to atmosphere. They noticed tone. They learned how much a face or voice could reveal. They understood when a room felt prosperous, tense, weary, or volatile. This kind of social intelligence is common in hospitality economies, but in Las Vegas it spread beyond the resort walls. A city that monetizes mood teaches people to read mood very well indeed. This could make local life more polished and more guarded. Friendliness might be genuine, but it was often accompanied by a trained awareness of boundaries and consequences. Boundaries, of course, remained central to the city's racial life. While public pressure for change increased, the older arrangements did not simply dissolve. They persisted in habits, expectations, property access, patterns of welcome, and the unequal distribution of civic confidence. What changed first was not always the material reality itself, but the legitimacy of that reality. More people understood that the city could no longer comfortably present itself as modern while leaving such visible exclusions intact. That mattered because legitimacy is one of the quiet supports of any unequal system. Once people begin to withdraw the assumption that an arrangement is natural, its days become numbered, even if it still has considerable power. For Black residents, this shift brought both possibility and strain. There could be greater hope that the city might be forced to live up, however partially, to the openness it sold. But hope inside unequal conditions is tiring work. It requires organization, patience, risk, and a willingness to push against a civic culture that often preferred discomfort to remain unspoken. Everyday life in West Las Vegas, then, contained not just endurance but increasing attentiveness to leverage, where pressure might be applied, which alliances mattered, how national changes might be used locally, and how to insist on dignity in a city that had long benefited from withholding full recognition. Meanwhile, many white residents found themselves navigating a quieter kind of unease. Some were sincerely sympathetic to calls for change. Others were anxious about disruption more than injustice. Still others simply wanted the city's prosperity to continue without being forced to confront too directly what had made that prosperity possible. This range of reactions mattered because Las Vegas was not large enough for groups to remain entirely abstract to one another. People shared schools indirectly, employers directly, neighborhoods unevenly, and the same civic future whether they admitted it or not. The city's compactness made moral distance harder to maintain once public questions sharpened. Questions of labor and race also intersected in practical ways that made Las Vegas especially susceptible to pressure. Because the hospitality economy depended on smooth operation and carefully managed appearances, even modest disruptions could carry symbolic weight. A city selling fantasy does not like reminders that its fantasy has terms and conditions. This is why ordinary workers could matter so much. Not because every individual held dramatic power, but because the entire city was built on their continued willingness to perform steadiness. When that steadiness became self-conscious, when workers knew the city needed them not just physically but atmospherically, the meaning of labor changed. It became easier to see that keeping Las Vegas running was itself a form of influence. This was also a period in which corporate and managerial thinking grew firmer, and that altered the emotional life of work. Earlier Las Vegas had often been remembered, sometimes too romantically, as a place where personality mattered enormously and improvisation could still shape outcomes. By the 1960s, the city was increasingly interested in scalable polish. Procedures thickened, branding sharpened, customer experience became more systematized. On paper, this looked like progress. In human terms, it often meant that workers had to fit themselves more precisely into pre-designed expectations. One can feel this in the difference between a place that seems alive through rough edges and one that feels alive through tightly controlled presentation. The former may be unstable but forgiving. The latter can be smoother and more exhausting. Exhaustion remained one of the hidden constants of Las Vegas life. It lived in the drawn curtains at noon, in the careful way a spouse moved through a room so as not to wake the sleeper, in the coffee taken before another late shift, in the feet soaked after work, in the family meal that had to happen at an odd hour because that was when everyone happened to be conscious at once. Histories centered only on glamour missed this essential domestic fact. Las Vegas reorganized the household clock. It bent family time around visitor time. That may sound like a minor detail, but it shaped marriages, parenthood, children's routines, and the emotional weather of the home. The home itself remained a place of aspiration and defense. It was where people tried to recover from the city's demands and assert another kind of order. Clean furniture, a cool room if possible, food prepared with care, school papers pinned up, church clothes ready, a bit of yard maintained against the desert, a television in the corner, perhaps a record player, perhaps family photographs arranged on a shelf. These things mattered because they made life feel personal rather than merely functional. In a city where so much labor disappeared into somebody else's comfort, creating comfort for one's own household could feel deeply meaningful. And still the city pressed in. Through television, through visitors, through the rhythm of shifts, through road expansion, through new hotel openings, through the subtle rise in expectations about how Las Vegas ought to look and perform, residents were continually reminded that their hometown was no longer just theirs in any uncomplicated sense. It belonged partly to the nation's imagination. It belonged partly to capital. It belonged partly to the travelers passing through. The unresolved question was how much it might also truly belong to the people teaching in its schools, raising children in its heat, sitting in its churches, cleaning its rooms, and coming home at dawn with tired eyes and resort dust on their shoes. That question grew sharper because the city's image of effortless leisure depended so heavily on invisible forms of discipline. Not only labor discipline, but civic discipline too. Who was expected to wait, who was expected to defer, who was asked to be patient for reform, who was told to remain grateful for opportunity, who had to make the city's contradictions feel natural so that visitors never had to notice them. Once those expectations became more visible, they could no longer operate as quietly as before. The city's famous calm was beginning to conceal a more active negotiation over power, dignity, and voice. This did not mean that everyday life ceased to contain tenderness, beauty, or routine pleasures. The desert evenings still softened in a way that made front yards, porches, and neighborhood conversations feel briefly timeless. Families still marked birthdays. School bands still played. Neighbors still helped one another in small emergencies. Churches still filled with familiar faces. Teenagers still laughed in parked cars. Parents still worried over report cards, saving money, and whether a child's future might be easier than their own. These continuities matter because they remind us that historical tension does not erase ordinary life. It saturates it, and by now Las Vegas was saturated. These contradictions were no longer distant background conditions. They were becoming part of what residents understood the city to be. Not just a glamorous desert playground. Not just a boomtown grown sophisticated, but a place whose brightness depended on increasingly visible asymmetries of race, labor, class, and belonging. The lights had not dimmed. If anything, they were becoming more elaborate. But more of the people living under them were learning to ask what exactly those lights were illuminating and what they had long been designed to keep in shadow. And perhaps that is the final truth about everyday life in 1950s Las Vegas, and the city that emerged from it. The lights were never the whole story, but they were never nothing either. Las Vegas was not simply a fraud in the desert, nor was it the effortless wonderland of its own publicity. It was something more human than either version allows. It was a place where glamour and fatigue lived side by side, where ordinary families built routines in the shadow of extraordinary performance, where beauty could be real even when it was manufactured, and where a city selling freedom often depended on people whose own lives were tightly structured by work, inequality, and the constant management of appearances. For visitors, mid-century Las Vegas offered release. For residents, it offered a more complicated bargain. It could mean wages, movement, novelty, access to a wider world, and the thrilling sense of living somewhere the rest of the country could not stop talking about. But it could also mean dry mornings, broken sleep, careful budgets, quiet tension behind front doors, neighborhoods divided by power, and the strange experience of serving a fantasy grander than the life one could afford within it. That contradiction did not make the city unreal. It made it historically legible. What made Las Vegas so fascinating was not merely that it glowed in the desert, but that it condensed so much of post-war America into one vivid, restless place. Consumption and labor, optimism and exclusion, suburban comfort and civic inequality, spectacle and routine, private exhaustion and public ease. It took national habits and made them visible at high contrast. In that sense, the city was never only about gambling or neon. It was about the American ability to turn atmosphere into industry and the equally American habit of hiding hard work behind a polished smile. To look closely at everyday life there is to recover the people who made the city possible without always being fully seen by it. The maids resetting rooms before noon. The cocktail waitresses reading moods in a second. The cooks, drivers, dealers, musicians, teachers, mechanics, cashiers, churchgoers, parents, and children living ordinary lives in a place famous for seeming anything but ordinary. Their Las Vegas was not the postcard, though the postcard depended on them completely. Their city was one of school bells and shift changes, dust and cool air, church clothes and uniforms, modest homes and magnificent lobbies, hope and calculation held together day after day. And in the end, that may be why the place still lingers so powerfully in the imagination. Not because it was simpler than people think, but because it was more layered. The famous version of Las Vegas invites curiosity. The real, everyday version invites recognition. It reminds us that even the most glittering cities are sustained by routines, compromises, and human endurance. that luxury is often a surface laid carefully over labor, and that history becomes most interesting when we stop staring only at the marquee and begin listening for the quieter lives moving behind it. If there is one thing people today may still misunderstand about that world, it is this: the residents of 1950s Las Vegas were not living inside a permanent party. They were living inside a growing system, learning how to find dignity, stability, and belonging in a place built to make transience feel glamorous. Some loved it. Some resisted it. Most did what people in every era do. They adapted, hoped, worked, worried, and kept going. And because of that, the city becomes easier to understand. Not as a myth and not as a moral lesson, but as a lived place. A desert city of neon and housekeeping carts, steak dinners and grocery lists, atomic age bravado and quiet family fatigue, bold promises and uneven realities. A place where the American dream was staged brilliantly every night, and then cleaned up before morning by people who still had to make breakfast, wake the children, pay the bills, and begin again. If a detail from this world surprised you most, or if there is a part of 1950s Las Vegas that felt hardest to imagine living through, I'd be glad to hear it. And if you'd like to return for more calm, thoughtful journeys into the past, there will always be another story waiting just beyond the lights.